have experienced seeing this happen. Why does apple float and why does kiwi sink? Have you heard about Archimedes principle and buoyant force? Let's experience together the practices related to Archimedes principle and buoyant force with a simple experiment. Look, I'm holding a balance with an apple and then a kiwi. Let's weigh the mass of the apple and the kiwi in air. Now, if I put the apple and the kiwi into water, let's see what happened. Look at the balance. We can see both become lighter than when they are weighted in water. Let's look at the theory behind how this works. And later we find out the answer why apple become lighter and floating while it is put in water. Wait, when in air, an apple, kiwi or any object has a certain weight. The direction of its weight are pointed toward the ground due to the influence of gravity. Before we go any further, let's look at the definition of Archimedes principles and the buoyant force. Let's come back to the apple and kiwi. When it is put into water, it apparently becomes lighter because the buoyant force, Fb, in the water thrusts it upward. Now kiwi, when it is in water, it becomes lighter too, but it sinks into the water. Why does this happen? The reason is that the kiwi is denser than the apple. We will discuss more about density later. Now we know about buoyant force. Next, let's find the buoyant force in water for apple and kiwi by doing a simple experiment. Now, look at the mass of the water displaced. Before we move on, let's look at the theory first. Alright, let's move on with our experiment. When we put the apple and kiwi into the water, we can see the water displaced. To get the weight of an object, we need to times the mass with the gravity. We found that the weight of water displaced is equal to the buoyant force. As we already know, the mass of fluid displaced are equal to its volume times its density. And the weight of fluid displaced is equal to its mass times gravity. Therefore, we get that buoyant force is equal to the weight of fluid displaced, which is also equal to its volume times its density times gravity. This is what we call the Archimedes principle. Now, to determine whether an object will float or sink, let's look at the relationship between buoyant force and density. We can use this to determine whether an object will float or sink based on its density. So, what is density? Okay, let's go back to our examples, the apple and the kiwi. We can see that apple float and kiwi sink. Why does this happen? This is because the density of the apple is lower than the density of the water. We can see that only a part of the apple's body is in the water. We can find the fraction of the volume of the floating apple and its submerged part by using this formula. The volume of an apple in the water, which is equal to volume of water displaced, divided by the volume of the whole body of the apple is equal to the density of apple divided by the density of water. By referring to Archimedes principles, the fraction of a floating object which is submerged is equal to the ratio of the density of the object to the density of the fluid. We have studied the relationship between buoyant force and density, whether an object will float or sink. Now we will study how to calculate the density of a floating object by determining its volume, especially for apple. To calculate the density of an apple, first we have to know its volume. Now to get the volume of whole apple, which are floating when we put it in water, we can use this simple trick. Push it all the way in with our finger or whatever that helps, so it's submerged entirely in water. This way, we can get the volume of the whole apple from the volume of water displaced. Now, to find the density of an object, we divide the mass of an object with its volume. To measure the volume of object, we can use the measuring cylinder to measure the volume of water displaced in milliliter, then convert it to centimeter cube. With a simple trick, we now get the density of the whole apple. But remember, we only do this with floating objects. Now we can determine why an object floats or sinks into water. The way to do this is simply to divide the density of an object with the density of water. If the result for the density of an object divided by the density of water is lower than 1, the object will float. If the result for the density of an object divided by the density of water is equal or more than 1, then the object will sink. As a conclusion, we get from our simple experiment here is that buoyant force in water is equal to the apparent weight loss of an object in water, which is also equal to the weight of water displaced by that object. Or in other words, Archimedes' principle says that buoyant force equals the weight of water displaced. In relation to density, an object with lower density than the density of water will float, while an object with high density than water will sink.